topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Who is January Jones? She is not a young, beautiful, talented actress on Mad Men. She is not an older, gorgeous, exotic dancer from the Johnny Carson show. She is an author, and she wrote Thou Shalt Not Whine, the 11th Commandment, that reached #1 at Amazon.com. She is a reality TV golf personality with World High Stakes Golf televised on HDNet. She is a humorist and winologist expert. She is your featured host today on January Jones Sharing Success Stories. So sit back, relax, and get ready to laugh and listen to Ms. Jones with her eclectic roster of guests as you learn life's lessons. These stories plus sharing equals success. Welcome, and remember, beware, because you are entering the no whining world of January Jones.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a glittery, glowing day. I'm January Jones, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast today. As you know, I have a new brand, Glitter Granny, and I'm advertising my website, glittergranny.com. We sell at this website, we sell glitter jewelry, cups, hats, you name it, we sell it. I'm an associate affiliate with Amazon, along with my golden doodle, Ginger Ale. Now, every granny out there, it's time for you to get ready to glitter and glow with us and go shopping with us. Go to glittergranny.com and be prepared to start spending some money. Once you go there, you'll sign up and you can get my free ebook, Thou Shalt Not Whine, the 11th Commandment. It went to #1 at Amazon in religion and humor. Who knew? Profits from this website go to Disabled American Veterans, Sarasota, Florida, Company A. Now let me ask you a question. Have you ever met an investigative reporter? Yeah, we're going to meet one today. Tell me, have you ever even met a journalist, a real live journalist? Have you ever met a journalist who has an amazing story to tell and who happens to be a Pulitzer Prize winner? Tell me, what do you know about the CIA and its connection to journalism? Or can you imagine how a journalist could be connected to the CIA? Well, I can imagine anything these days. So now let me ask you, have you ever heard about a book? It's called The Manchurian Journalist. Yeah, I know, we've all heard about The Candidate, but now this book is called The Manchurian Journalist. If you can answer yes or maybe to any of these questions, then you are in the right place. And I'd like to welcome you to January Jones Sharing Senior Success Stories. Today, I want to tell you a little bit about my guest. But before I do, it's time for you to rest, relax, go get some cheese, get some crackers, get a glass of wine, and join us in the No Wine Zone. Now, let me tell you about my guest today. He is an investigative journalist, reporter, whose career is marked by high-profile stories throughout the years. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer, and he has spent more than 40 years on the front lines of American journalism for newspapers and for magazines. His recent book is an in-depth, extensively documented research critical examination of the Fourth Estate. It's a tough look at what must be done to restore the independence and integrity of America's watchdog of democracy, its independent journalists. He is the author of The Manchurian Journalist, Lawrence Wright, the CIA, and the Corruption of American Journalism. It's my pleasure to welcome to the show today, Dan Luzadder. Hi, Dan. How are you doing?
Hi, January. Thanks for having me on. I'm doing great today.
Oh, and you know what? I forgot to add, you also have a dog named Al Capone.
Well, I'm sorry to say that Al has passed on, but he was a great companion for many years, and he certainly heard me tell many stories over the course of that, because when nobody else would listen to me, he always would.
That's why I've made Ginger Ale my assistant for Glitter Granny. And she never argues with me. That's the best
part. An important trait.
Well, we're going to talk, first of all, about your career. I know you started amazingly when you were only 15 years, and you had a job with a newspaper. Could you tell us a little bit about your early success story, and who were your mentors? Who helped you start in this wonderful career?
Well, interestingly, I had many mentors along the way at various levels and in various places, but I got interested in journalism when I was still in high school, and I had a mentor who was an English teacher who quickly recognized that while I couldn't do much else, I could write a simple sentence. And so I went, it was during the Vietnam War, and I went immediately from a high school graduation into college, so I could get a college deferment at the time, and right onto a college newspaper, and did some sports reporting for the college paper. And then a job came up on the local daily to work police beat. And of course, I'd had a pretty sheltered life by that point, but I had my eyes opened in the early days of working the night cops beat and trying to cover everything that moved. These were the days of linotypes and hard deadlines, and things were always up and in a hurry in the newsroom. And so it was a real education, but it was also a kind of adrenaline rush that hooked me and kept me in the business for a long time afterward.
Wow. You know, my husband and I, we are still big fans. We subscribe to 2 newspapers every day that are delivered to the house. We can't start our day without our coffee and reading the newspapers. And then later on, we turn on the TVs to get their slant on the news.
Yeah, and usually a different take, I'm sure.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And you started out in Fort Wayne?
Well, I started out in Muncie, my hometown, actually, Muncie, Indiana. But then after I graduated college, I spent a few months as an Amish carpenter, and then decided I really did want to do journalism. And so at the time, there were hardly any jobs available in journalism. It was an economic downturn. But I found an opening at the Fort Wayne News Sentinel on their copy desk. And while I wanted to be a writer, and the last thing I really wanted to do was edit copy, I took the job to get back in the door. And I stayed in that job for almost a year. And then the editor called me into his office, and he said, close the door. He said, "You're the worst copy editor I ever hired." And I said, "Oh my gosh, I keep my dictionary close at hand. I know I'm not a great speller," but he said, "No, it's not that." He said, "You rewrite everybody's copy, and it sounds like you." He said, "I got 35 reporters out there. I'd like for them to sound like themselves."
Oh my God.
"So am I fired?" He said, "No, you're our new columnist." So I didn't have much to write about in those days. The column was called Street Talk, and I I just was imagining what it might be. But later on, I developed a lot of sources out on the street and wrote a lot of human interest columns, and
That,
it was there that I really cut my teeth on writing, I think.
okay, that fascinates me. How many columns a week did you have to produce?
I did 3 a week, and over the course of the years I was there, some 900 columns altogether. But while it started, the column started out as an idea of being able to tell stories about common people. I didn't have any sources at the start, but by the end, I developed so many sources that I started doing investigative stories on the side.
Oh,
And I exposed a plot to commit murder while it was in process and brought the police in on it. And then later, I investigated a hotel arson in which I turned up evidence of public corruption. And it was then not too long after that, I got an offer from the Indianapolis Star to join their investigative team, which was a pretty high profile and very efficient team. And then I got into the hardcore kinds of reporting.
yeah, let's back up a little bit on this columnist career you started out with. Now, that would terrify me to have 3 deadlines each week. And how long was each column?
Well, they were usually about 700, 750 words. But of course, by the time I'd done that, I had been out there in the trenches writing stories under deadline, and I had become pretty accustomed to the need to write fast. And I like to tell, I always told my kids about the toughest night on police beat. I did 11 stories under byline in one night, and there was no time to take notes, so I had to keep it all in my head. But so that gave me, I think, some foundation for doing that. Plus, I took the column places that most columnists don't go. When I found it tough to find a column, I'd take a walk through the snow in the local park and reflect on the changing seasons. So you could always find something to write about. And I always told my kids, I can write 750 words on anything.
And my gosh, 900 columns, that just blows my mind. And was that your first book, Street Talk?
Well, Street Talk actually and the Manchurian Journalist came out not only in the same month, but on the same day from 2 different publishers. There's a little bit of irony for you, but the Street Talk book was really inspired by my daughter, who's listened patiently to stories over the years, and finally she said, you should collect these columns in a book. And I said, well, who has time? And she said, I'll curate for you. So she did the curation and the editing, and
oh my gosh, up there, that's cheating.
we got it published. So it's, as I've told her, and as I've commented on that book, it was one of the times in my career that I think I enjoyed the most, because I was still learning and experimenting and trying my hand at different things. And by the time we got to the Pulitzer material, which was the coverage of a flood in Fort Wayne in 1982, and I shared that award with other members of the staff. But my work was collected in college textbooks on how to write feature stories under the press of deadline.
Wow!
So that was a nice thing to have happened. But telling stories was, became part of my DNA, and I'm still doing it. I'm 76. I'm active still.
76. Wow, you're just a kid to me. It's interesting. I wrote my first book when I was 50, and as I look back over 30 years, I just am so amazed at what has happened in the publishing world, and what we have gone from. The first book was a do-it-yourself, and then all of a sudden the evolution of writing, which has become possible for just pretty much anyone who has a computer. Yeah. And things like Kindle and direct publishing and Amazon. For writers, this is just an amazing time to be alive, isn't it?
It is. It's there are lots of different opportunities out there. Although I think it's also, and I've commented on this as I've talked about journalism and the change in journalism during my years
Right.
involved with it, that while we saw the internet as an opportunity to open things up beyond the gatekeepers of the traditional media, we've also gotten so many voices out there that we're not sure who to listen to and how much credibility they might have.
Yeah,
And so
it's become a totally confusing time as far as people who are interested in getting the news, people who are interested in reporting the real news, and all the opinions. It's just been very confusing for everyone. But one thing I'm not confused about, and that's about being Glitter Granny. We're going to hear from her, and we'll be right back with Dan.
Welcome to Glitter Granny Gifts to Give or to Get. Hosted by January Jones, aka Glitter Granny, and her golden doodle ginger ale. If you're a granny who wants to glitter and glow, it's time to join us for a sparkling shopping experience that will be unique and so very special. Whenever you need a unique and spectacular gift, then Granny will help you find it. Along with gifts for family, friends, and holidays, there are even glitter gifts for coworkers, in-laws, doctors, and you can even find something for your friend who has everything. If you need a really good gag gift, you'll find it here. Hats, canes, shoes, accessories. When it comes to glitter accessories, Granny and Ginger Ale are on board with everything you can imagine, and then some more. The favorites are at her website, and remember, she is adding to this list almost every day with lots of fun gifts to give or to get. Granny has created a website that is glamorous and glows with glitter products to wear or to use every day. As she says, if it ain't got bling, it doesn't mean a thing. Now let me tell you about her glitter hat collection. She actually has too many to count. Her collections are must-have accessories for any glitter granny who enjoys getting attention everywhere she goes. Remember, if people are going to stare at you, make it worthwhile for them. And canes? Everyone will ask you, where did you get it? Can I get one too? Now, just go to glittergranny.com and check it out.
Welcome back with my guest, Dan Luzadder. Dan, this wonderful, you have 2 books out now. And could you share with our listeners where they can get them and your website information?
Well, Amazon.com, of course, and BarnesandNoble.com. They're available from Trying Day, the publisher, at tryingday.com, and Street Talk from BritainPublishing.com, and also from Amazon, et cetera. I'm still in the process of sewing my website together, but danluzadder.com is that site, and so you'll find referrals there on to Trying Day.
Yeah, and we'll be featuring Dan's book at Glitter Granny Bookshelf, where we'll take you directly to Amazon, where you can order both of his books. Dan, let's talk about some of the stories that you were involved on. I know you mentioned the flood story where you got the Pulitzer Prize, right. But did your burger? I thought the burger chef story was fascinating in that they were never actually caught.
No. And I'm working on a documentary film with an LA filmmaker right now on this case. And it's a case that I've been looking at really since 1980. It was an event, the murders of 4 kids from a Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway, Indiana, in the veritable shadow of the Indianapolis 500 racetrack,
Uh-huh.
was the third, actually, of a series of crimes that occurred over 6 months. And there was another murder, the murder of a grandmother in her garage in a apparent assassination. And then there were a string of bombings in Speedway that followed a month later that
Uh-huh.
lasted for several days, and then this kidnapping and murder case. So the murders, none of them have ever been solved, but someone went to prison for the bombings. And he became quite well known during the presidential campaign for George W. Bush, because he said from prison that he had sold marijuana to the vice presidential candidate, Dan Quayle.
Oh,
And
wow.
so there was a lot of controversy. A book was written about him, about that.
Yeah.
But but the true story behind the bombings and the murders has to do with police corruption that has never really been exposed. And I believe that the reason that the murders have never been solved is
Right.
because of a cover up that occurred and a wrongful conviction for this individual in the Speedway bombings.
Oh my gosh. Wow. Fascinating. And then I'm in the process of your book, but I've been jumping around just so I can figure out some good questions. Um, Tell us a little bit about what it was like being covering the Columbine tragic story.
Columbine was really the last major project I did for daily newspapers
I see.
on an investigative side. And I was working for the Rocky Mountain News in Denver, the late, great Rocky Mountain News, which closed several years ago, unfortunately.
Sadly.
But it was an interesting time. My involvement in the Columbine coverage came with some hesitation. Even though I had been hired as an investigative reporter, I had been moved over to cover the State House by an editor who I'd had a couple clashes with over what we should be writing about or not. So I was kind of on a punishment detail there at the State House. While a lot of people like to cover the legislature, it wasn't what I wanted to be doing.
Mhm.
But when Columbine happened, they called in all the reporters from everywhere, but they didn't call me into the newsroom to participate. And 2 days went by, and I didn't get a call.
Hmm.
But but on the third day, the city editor called me, and he said they had a problem and they needed my help. And I said, "What's the problem, and how can I help?" And they said, "Well, the Denver Post had maintained its police beat and had kept a reporter assigned there, but the Rocky had failed to keep a police beat reporter working on the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department. So they had no sources. And of course, the police were not answering their telephones, so they were idly leaving messages and not getting any return." I said, "Well, what is it you want me to do?" He said, "Can you find out who's running the investigation?"
Oh.
And I said, "Okay, give me an hour." And so I had done, not too long prior to that, I had done an investigation into organized crime attempting to take over the taxi industry in Denver. And
Okay.
in the course of that, I uncovered drug running and gun running that had gone on using the taxis. And so I had developed a lot of sources in the underground gun industry environment. And so I started calling sources who were informants for police that I had met or known. And finally, I found one, and I asked him what the police were most focused on. And he said they were looking for tying down where the guns came from in Columbine. And
Oh.
so I asked him, where did they come from? And he said, "I can't tell you. However, if you'll look up a case of a Jefferson County Sheriff's deputy who was shot and killed, I think you'll find the gun came from the same place as the guns the police are looking for."
Wow. Wow.
So I called the newsroom's library right away. I got the information on the detective who had handled that investigation,
Hmm.
officer, and I called his phone. And of course, I got a recording, but I said, "I'd like to know where the guns came from that was used to kill Officer Musbrucker," and left my number. And about 15 minutes later, I got a call from Tom Kitbush, who was running the investigation. He said, "You asked a question of my detective. I want to know why." I
Oh.
said, meet me for coffee, and I'll tell you. And
Mm-hmm.
so we negotiated an agreement where I would come on the inside of the investigation, and I spent the next several months working with the cops on the inside and seeing everything that they had seen and doing interviews with police officers
Oh, wow.
affected by the investigation. So thoroughly.
That's a great story for an investigative reporter.
Well, you got to use your sources and your angles wherever you can.
Yeah, it's connection, connection, connection. And I love the part where you say, let's go have a cup of coffee. Because that means let's really talk.
That's right.
Okay, and then you jumped into this Manchurian journalist, which was an incredible title, I have to tell you, just because of the connection most of our generation and everyone has with that word and the Manchurian Candidate, which was such a famous book, movie. Great title. And you're looking at the connection between the CIA and journalism, basically, aren't you?
Yes. And I didn't expect to go to that place ever, and really didn't head that direction for any particular reason other than I did some work for a little magazine which was based out of LA called Freedom Magazine, which was owned by the Church of Scientology. And and I was contacted by them. They were looking to revive their magazine and were looking for an investigative reporter. And so I knew nothing about Scientology at the time. I began to explore it. I found what controversy there was surrounding it. But one of the things they asked me to do was take a look into the media coverage as to whether or not it had been fair and honest. And among that media coverage was a book called Going Clear by Lawrence Wright. He's an author for The New Yorker. He's written many books. He's written books about many different subjects. And so I began to take a look at the book for accuracy and for intent. And as I was doing that research, I decided I should background Lawrence Wright a little bit. Right. And what I discovered was something I didn't expect to find, which was that he had ties to some very powerful individuals in Dallas, Texas, who were involved deeply with CIA activities and directly with efforts to influence American media in newspapers and magazines and in book publishing most dramatically. And then as I continued to pull threads on that story, discovered that Lawrence Wright had participated in some programs that were dedicated through the CIA and its intelligence affiliates in the private sector to help develop propaganda programs throughout the world, really, but also focus backward at the American public. And so the book details my investigation into that and documents how I uncovered those things and raises questions about the use of journalists and journalist ties to intelligence communities that are not disclosed to the public and to their readers. And so that's what the book looks at. It looks at the role of journalism in our American democracy and the importance of it, and also at how the press can be manipulated in ways that we don't realize and don't understand.
Well, as I told you before we went on the air, we lived in California, and the Scientology thing that took place there was incredible. Of course, so many of the Hollywood people, Tom Cruise, and all of that was so out in the public. And it's interesting that, in your opinion, how did it get resolved?
Which part? There were many parts of controversy, but when I
still in business.
What?
They're still in business, aren't they?
They're still in business, most certainly.
Yes.
And even though there has been extensive criticism and accusations of cult activity and a lot of negative press, what I found in my research was that very little of that was based on factual information. more on rumor and innuendo. That doesn't mean that there weren't significant controversies involving the church and disagreements, but I think when I actually traveled the world, meeting people in churches as far away as Hungary and Australia, and I did say when I went to work in this relationship, I said, any question that I ask about what happened, I need to see documentation on.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And they were good about providing that.
Really?
I think one of the they were excellent at providing documentation, as a matter of fact. And there were sessions in which boxes and boxes of materials were carted into rooms to make them available to take a look at. But one of the reasons that, as I say in the book, that I decided to take a look and to take on this challenge of looking at the media coverage, focused backward at my own industry, was that I think my history has been one in which I've not assumed that what everyone believes is true is necessarily true. And I spent many years investigating conditions in state and federal prisons. And in order to do that, you've got to suspend some personal beliefs or concerns or ideas about who the people are that you're writing about. And so I had some practice at that. I had developed such a significant source network at one time in the Indiana state prisons that when there was a hostage taking on death row, the inmates insisted on negotiating with me. And I was called in to negotiate for hostages that night on.
Oh my gosh. Wow. And it's great because we're from that generation that we know all about sources, bibliographies, and documentation. That's where it's all at. Right now, I'm going to share with everyone a book that I recently have written, and it's now available at Amazon.to.
Introducing Living and Dying Without Whining, a memoir. 80 years of magical moments, written by January Jones. Ms. Jones shares her most exciting and magical moments. Patriotic moments. Landing on aircraft carrier USS Carl Vinson. Staying overnight, then catapulting off. Revealing moments. Working for the CIA for 5 years. Thrilling and comforting moments. Meeting Charles Lindbergh and Neil Armstrong together. Sassy moments. Swinging 60s and the 70s. The age of Aquarius. Exciting moments. As a TV contestant on Joker's Wild and Family Feud. Reality moments. Playing in the World Series of Golf on reality TV. Career moments. As a stewardess for Eastern Airlines. Touching moments. With meeting a half-brother she never knew about. With many, many more magical moments. Living and Dying Without Whining, a memoir. 80 years of magical moments, written by January Jones. Available at Amazon.com and Audible.com.
Welcome back with my guest, Dan Luzadder. Dan, let's talk a little bit now about the deep state. This is a term we hear all the time, and I'd be curious to know your theory, because, we hear deep state, but we don't usually hear names connected to it.
Not normally. Well, in the course of researching this book, journalist, I started going back in history to better understand what the environment was like, and why there was a program, why there were programs that existed to propagandize the American public. And so within that research, I discovered some interesting things that I was not aware of, and most people probably are not aware of. But at the end of World War II, when there was the initial development of the Central Intelligence Agency as a civilian intelligence agency, there were a lot of cautions I discovered at the time, and a lot of disagreement. And in fact, Harry Truman was one of those who wasn't convinced that a civilian intelligence agency was the right thing for them to do. But eventually, there were a number of very powerful individuals who had extreme influence, who were able to help direct and shape the nature of the Central Intelligence Agency. And those included people like John McCloy, who, when he passed, the New York Times described as the chairman of the establishment. He was a powerful lawyer. He had a lot of experience with intelligence organizations in the course of his lawyerhood. He became Assistant Secretary of War during World War II, and he was the governor for the occupation of Germany. And he helped shape decisions that were made in the Nuremberg war trials about prosecution of individuals who were involved in intelligence on the Eastern Front for the Nazis. And the agency ended up recruiting many hundreds of agents that had worked this Eastern Front, even though they had been considered for trial for war crimes. And those individuals became part of the international organization that the CIA was affiliated with. And John McCloy was an individual who, with his experience in intelligence, believed in the importance of, say, black bag jobs, which were secret operations that might be conducted wherever necessary. And even though the CIA was prohibited by law from operating within the confines of the U.S., what I discovered was that there was a very thin membrane between what was considered domestic and what was considered international. And that was very porous, especially in their interest in helping shape Western cultural ideas and fighting communism. And so that included recruiting publishers and people to work in the publishing industry, those people who would select people who were going to have good careers and as writers. And it was a very extensive network that was carefully groomed, and it was funded by foundations that were formed as front companies for the Central Intelligence Agency. One of those was called the Hoblitzell Foundation out of Dallas, Texas, affiliated with Republic National Bank. And also affiliated with the bank was a man named Robert Story, who was the head of the American Bar Association, head of the International Bar Association, and the chief executive trial prosecutor in the Nuremberg war trials, also making decisions about who would and would not be prosecuted. And so in this network out of Dallas, there was tremendous financial influence for these clandestine programs domestically. And some of that came to light in various newspaper reports over time, disclosures that happened in Congress, some of them accidental. And so gradually those programs became visible, but they were not reported about in an omnibus way by major media like the New York Times or the Washington Post or others. And as I looked further, I began to see where journalists were favored by the agencies, and those who were willing to help indoctrinate on certain ideas what was acceptable or what was not acceptable to report, including things like racism and other things that have been detrimental to the democracy.
Okay, so then you zeroed in on Lawrence Wright in particular, who I believe is still working for the New Yorker.
Yes.
Yeah.
And still writing.
And I believe he has told his associates generally not to talk to you, right?
That's correct. He did so on Twitter, and he said that I was not a reporter, but a private investigator
Oh,
hired by Scientology to stalk him, which
oh,
was not true. I had had several conversations with Lawrence Wright by the time he posted that, and he knew well what my background was and what I was after, which was to talk to him about the things that I had found, the same way any journalist would approach it if they were to approach it.
hmm, very
But
good. You were just doing your job. Um, Interesting connection. A lot of connections there, aren't there?
there are many connections, and as I would discover, there was a very interesting character in this mix, in this history, a woman named Helen Venn, and she had led an interesting life. She was from Oregon, and she wound up married to a man who had deep ties to the British intelligence network. She went on to found something called the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course. And
Hmm.
many people have vaguely heard of that course because yearly it published a list of the 100 most read novels and the top 100 list. But the Radcliffe Publishing Procedures course existed as a 6-week summer course at Radcliffe College each
Mhm.
year, and it recruited some 60 to 70 individuals who were interested in being in the publishing industry.
Oh,
And it turns out that Helen Venn, in addition to doing that, was representing the State Department in something called the Franklin Books Project, which was a propaganda program funded through the CIA and the State Department. And when I
oh,
realized that, and also realized that Lawrence Wright had been a student in her class in 1969, I
okay.
began to track elements of her relationship and association and her important work in helping populate the publishing industry with individuals that had been recruited through her program. She had a 96 or 97% placement rate for graduates of her 6-week summer course in the
Wow.
publishing industry. And
That that
that's a pretty amazing success rate.
unheard of. Wow.
So these ties and the fact that the Hoblitzell Foundation in Dallas and the relationship with Robert Story became important because Robert Story owned a storefront bank and hired Lawrence Wright's father to run that bank for him. And that bank, I discovered, also had more loan officers working for it than it could support with its financial performance. And so had all the earmarks of what they call in the intelligence network non-official cover for people who were doing intelligence tasks.
Let me ask you this pretty much. Uh, it's been my observation as a amateur investigator. I've written a book about the Kennedys, and in general, I'd say a pretty good track to follow is follow the money. Did you find that to be true?
And it certainly was true with the foundations that were funded secretly and
Mhm.
whose monies were being channeled into these programs. And
Yeah.
there were records of this, and they were trackable. And there had been some reporting, but I hadn't seen anywhere else really the tying to specific individuals, including Robert Story
Oh,
and John McCloy and others who were within that intelligence influence network. So I think the book covers some new ground as to what we might expect, but it also asks a question. Lawrence Wright was extremely influential in a book on the War on Terror. The book was called The Looming Tower, and it was an examination of Al Qaeda in the wake of 9/11. So when I came to understand his history, undisclosed history with individuals tied to these CIA programs, it raised for me a question as to what kind of source opportunities he had that many journalists might not have,
oh,
and how those sources might have colored his take on the war on terror, on Al Qaeda, and on 9/11.
Okay, yeah, and he had access that was quite amazing. Let me just, before we have to go, what's your take on this Bob Woodward, who is famous for the Watergate investigation as a reporter? And he's published more books than I can imagine anyone. And what's your take on Bob Woodward?
Well, interestingly enough, in the course of this, I worked with a man named Hank Albarelli, who had written a book about a scientist for the CIA, Frank Olson, during the days when the CIA was doing experiments with LSD. And Frank Olson wound up going out a 10th floor window in New York in the company of some other individuals from the agency. And there was always speculation that it was an LSD related matter. But Albarelli introduced me to a man named Len Kolodny. And Len Kolodny had written a book called The Silent Coup. And he had been a businessman, but he became interested in Bob Woodward after Bob Woodward was supervising a reporter that wrote a story about him. And he began to pursue some things pertaining to that, and then discovered that there were some things that the public didn't know about Bob Woodward, including the fact that he had been involved in naval intelligence while he was still with the U.S. Navy, and that he had been a briefer to Alexander Haig in the White House before he ever became a reporter at the Washington Post.
Oh, okay.
And so he tried to get Woodward, after his naval service, tried to get a job at the Washington Post, but was deferred to another newspaper, a smaller paper where he worked for a while. And then within a year went to the Washington Post, and then was assigned one of the major stories in our journalistic history, which has become a legend and really spawned so much of the interest in investigative reporting in the wake of Watergate.
Yeah.
Kolodny and I talked about the fact that he had reached the conclusion, and he did interviews with Woodward over this, and he said Woodward never denied his intelligence connections, but wouldn't talk directly about them. So I think there's more to the story, as we often say, about Bob Woodward's position in that. Now, Kolodny took the position that, much like many people believe in the Kennedy assassination, that Nixon's resignation was a regime change that was orchestrated by those who have intelligence connections that were interested in snubbing any efforts toward détente that Nixon was interested in, and the same with Kennedy.
Oh my gosh, it's all so fascinating.
It is a very complex world.
It is because it all kind of is weaving together.
Yes.
Kind of an interesting, strange way. And it's so interesting how a lot of our history goes back to that assassination. It was just a major turning point for our country and for the world. And a lot of people literally ran for cover.
Yes, they did.
Yeah.
I was a sophomore in high school when that happened, and I remember watching on our black and white television the events over the next weekend as it all unfolded and the nation was tied to its television screens, and we're still talking about it these many, many decades later.
Oh, for sure. I remember that Thanksgiving holiday. We just lived in front of the TV. Dan, thank you so much for coming on and sharing Manchurian Journalist with our listeners.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's been enjoyable meeting you and sharing you with everyone. And everyone, thank you for entering the No Wine Zone with us today. And we look forward to seeing you next Thursday. It's going to be Halloween week, and Ron Fitzgerald is coming on the show. And he actually is the mayor of Hell, Michigan. And we're going to share a lot of fun. I'm a former Michigander. I've never been to Hell, Michigan, but I'm sure it's going to be interesting. Thank you, everyone, and take care and stay safe.
We want to thank you for listening to January Jones Sharing Success Stories. Always remember Ms. Jones' personal mantra, if you can think it, you can do it. That's what all of our guests have done with their lives, and so can you. You are the ultimate success coach in your own life. All you need to do will be to start sharing your own story with your family and friends. We hope that our guest stories will encourage you to explore an equation in your future that will combine your creativity plus connecting with others will enable you to be successful too. Always remember, your passion plus your purpose will equal prosperity as you explore the wonderful world of January Jones.